Tonight, Stormont's problems continue to mount and there's clearly no silver bullet to solve them. As our politicians and business leaders return from their Christmas break, we're asking them to think about how all the big challenges can be tackled.
The evidence is there is a willingness to work in partnership with us, but there is still a lack of clarity as to whether the executive is prepared to take difficult decisions.
Am I optimistic that all of those things will be achieved? No. Am I hopeful that they could be with enough pushing and enough political will? Yes.
I'll be discussing those challenges and more with not one but two guest panels made up of MLAs, business leaders and expert commentators. Hello, we start the new year as we finish the last one looking at the big problems still facing Northern Ireland. And the continuing health crisis simply serves to remind us of what's at stake if we don't start to come up with some answers. So let's deal first with one potentially huge challenge which local ministers aren't responsible for creating, although they're well aware they'll have to deal with its widespread consequences. The decision by the Chancellor to increase employers' national insurance contributions kicks in 10 weeks' time. Northern Ireland's frontline services will be out of pocket by tens of millions of pounds, and businesses say the extra wage costs will increase prices, stall investment and prevent job creation. Well, joining me to discuss the potential impact of the changes are Selina Horshey, who's a hotelier and business leader in Derry. Diane Forsyth is a DUP MLA for Southdown, and Diana Armstrong is an Ulster Unionist MLA for Fermanagh and South Tyrone. So welcome to all of you, and thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme tonight. Diane Forsyth, let me just start with you because you brought your concerns to the Chamber this week, primarily about what this change will mean for frontline services. But let's just talk, first of all, if you don't mind, about the challenge for businesses. How concerned are you about what the difficulties that might be presented could be there?
Thanks very much for having me here this evening, Mark. And yes, I brought the motion because I'm extremely concerned. This Labour budget is taxing employers to death. There's a huge impact on our businesses and our public services. In terms of the announcement when it came out, I, as an accountant, looked into the details very quickly, and for our businesses, they're coming back with figures of £1,000 extra per member of staff. And the Northern Ireland Chamber survey came back with 81% of businesses citing extreme pressures and concerns to how they are able to deliver.
Selina, you spoke to us after the Westminster budget last autumn. People might remember what you had to say, and you talked about your concerns over these national insurance increases. What decisions are you as a business owner having to make as the changes get closer?
Well, with the increased costs of our wage bill, which already, because we're in hospitality, is a high percentage of our turnover. It used to be 30% pre-COVID, it's now closer to 40%. That means that we are having to look at where we can save money elsewhere and how we can raise additional funds. So the saving of money can be stalling on investment into the hotel property. We will be making decisions like, do we go ahead with certain renovation projects? What do we prioritise? And we're thinking about how do we actually make sure that we have enough money to cover our bills and pay all of our staff. And that means that ultimately we'll have to consider price rises, but that's very challenging in an area where people already are struggling with the amount of money in their pocket. And hospitality is obviously the last thing in the list that you spend on as things get cut. So we're concerned that overall people will spend less money in the business anyway.
And have you sat down and tried to do your sums to work out how much extra revenue you need to raise for the business to be able to pay the additional costs that are going to kick in just a few weeks' time?
Absolutely. So we are looking at a cost of about £2,500 per employee across our workforce. That is both national insurance rise contributions, but also there is a rise obviously in the national living wage. And whilst very few, less than 10% of our employees are on that, we have to keep a wage differential for the supervisors and everyone else. There's a knock-on effect. All in all, we're anticipating that our bill is going to go up in the region of £200,000. And to make that £200,000, we are going to have to be basically raising revenue of close to an extra £600,000 per annum to make that profit that allows us to pay that money out. That is really challenging. As a business, I already operate 364 days a year. It's not that I can open more hours. I have to just get additional revenue in some means. And I'm very concerned about putting up prices. Yeah,
but that's something you're going to have to look at. The danger, of course, is that if you put the prices up, fewer people think they can afford to come out, and it could actually have the opposite effect to what you're looking for.
Absolutely. It's going to be a real balancing act between cash flow versus profitability of the business. You need to have the cash flow to maintain. You need the profitability for long-term success.
And you're absolutely on your own with this. That's the point. There's nobody coming to help you. There's no discussion about how businesses could be helped under these circumstances. You've just got to live with it. Unless, of course, the Treasury changes its mind.
Well, absolutely. And we are, actually, I'm going with Hospitality Ulster as part of a delegation to meet with the Economy and the Finance Minister to discuss what options are open. Because whilst there are levers that the NI Executive could pull for us, including maybe using some of the Barnett consequentials that come from the rates relief that have been given in England to give some sort of interim hospitality relief, we also need to look into serious issues like rates reform. We've seen what England are doing in terms of looking at bands of rates that maybe address the fact that hospitality is less profitable than other areas, so should be at a less rateable value. And also, what are our opportunities around VAT, given, especially for those of us in a border region, we're now competing with a 9% VAT rate. OK, let's bring in Diane Armstrong from Fermanagh. You're a member of the Economy Committee, of course, so I know you've been thinking about this. You heard evidence from the Northern Ireland Chamber where members say that they really are concerned about what the implications might be. It's an issue for Assembly members, it's an issue for the Executive, but primarily, of course, as Selina Horsey has just said, we trace this right back to the Treasury, which is responsible for increasing these costs in the first place. What do you think can be done?
Well, in many senses, Mark, this evening, we are facing into a grim reality of further punitive charges on the business sector and in the wider public sector. I think what we really need to do is task our Finance Minister and our Economy Minister to represent the very real concerns outlined for all those sectors. I do welcome that the Finance Minister is conducting or has commissioned a survey into the impact of the budget increases. And we really need to go armed with that information, with that data, to show the real impact of what businesses are facing. I particularly do represent small business sector and the tourism sector. And I concur with Selina that the VAT differential is yet another, it's the third whammy coming in on the impacts that the businesses are facing at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, just to be clear, the Finance Minister has made it clear, or certainly her colleagues around her have made it clear, that she is already lobbying hard with those who control the levers over in Westminster, the Chancellor, the Chief Secretary to the Treasurer, the Minister of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. So that is happening, but there's no guarantee, of course, that it'll produce the result that you're all looking for.
There's absolutely no guarantee, but I mean, I think business to keep Northern Ireland working, we are all working with resolve as an executive to create a better economy, better society for our people. When we see the hard work that has been put in to provide public sector services, to have those now under that immense strain is something that's really risking an awful lot of the work that has gone on to stabilise this economy.
OK, we will come on to those public sector issues in a moment or two, so I'm going to bring you in, of course, on that, Diane. But I just want to go back to Selina, just to round out this conversation about the hospitality sector, because there are other pressures as well as these national insurance contributions. We've got the introduction of a new electronic travel authorisation scheme, which I know your sector is concerned about the potential implications of, and then the lowering of the VAT rate across the border, which means the differential between north and south is going to be greater than it currently is, and potentially that could be problematic.
Absolutely, and my business sits about 5 miles from the border. So if I have somebody in the local area who's considering where they might want to book a wedding for 200 people, they are going to be comparing the rates that I can offer to the rates that can be offered by a business in the Republic of Ireland with a lower VAT rate of 9% versus 20%, but also other differences in terms of things like the national living wage, which is about 15% lower in the Republic of Ireland. So it's not going to be possible for me to compete on the same rate basis, and that's going to be really, really challenging. And of course, we are always reliant on, we market ourselves as an island, as a destination. And if people are finding that there are barriers to entry in terms of crossing the border, like this electronic travel authorisation, there is a concern that that is going to be just that little bit that off-puts someone from making the journey to the north. OK, not straightforward. Diane Forsyth, let's go back to the National Insurance Employers' contributions. And that is not just a challenge, of course, for local businesses. Government departments, GPs, dentists, local councils, the voluntary sector will all have to find money to meet these increased employer contributions. And that is going to cost them all money.
Absolutely. And whenever the budget announcement came out, I was really concerned straight away as to how much this would actually mean, because our public services are all employers. It's an employer's contribution. So I submitted a series of questions across the different departments. The Department of Health came back to say it's going to cost them an extra £100 million in Northern Ireland. The Department of Education, through the Education Authority, it's an extra £51 million a year. And right across the board, it's looking like something just over £200 million, with it not to be completely clarified yet. And that also includes local councils that are going to see £12 million additional costs every year. And what's not included in that figure that concerns me greatly is the extra cost to our voluntary and community sector, who are out there on the front line delivering our public services through government contracts right across departments of health, education, justice, and they're going to see this huge increase in cost, but their contracts aren't going to go up. So effectively, it's going to be a frontline reduction in the availability of their services.
Saoirse Eastwood from the Alliance Party has tabled amendments on behalf of her party that seek to protect vital services. Proposals would exempt, for example, care homes, domiciliary care providers, GP and dental surgeries, pharmacists and so forth. So that's one move that's being made. I'm sure others will be made as well. If those are not successful, what are the potential consequences, do you think, to the services that are provided to the public? Because these are critical services we're talking
Absolutely.
about.
And in terms of your GPs and your dentists, these are services that operate, they are businesses, they're taking these employers' costs, but they cannot pass these along as increased charges to customers the way businesses do. So it's going to be a reduction in their capacity, a reduction in the availability of them to spend on their actual facilities. And in terms of the voluntary and community sector, I chair an all-party group in the Assembly on voluntary and community sector, and a big piece of work that we're trying to push forward is to get our entire executive to quantify the level of services that are being provided by the voluntary and community sector. But because there hasn't been a full audit of that and collation of that, I am so concerned that the impact of this will not be realised until we walk into this cliff edge that we're facing on the 1st of April, with mental health services that are being delivered at the front line by our voluntary and community sector. Our GPs are referring straight into our voluntary and community sector organisations. So if you have an organisation that's got a reduction of capacity and staff costs of £10,000, £20,000, how many less referrals from mental health services are they going to be able to take on board? And violence against women and girls is a key priority of the executive. You look at your organisations like Women's Aid, they have the contracts from the different health trusts to deliver the services on the front line to support that. OK, so you're clearly concerned about that and concerned about what you've described as a potential cliff edge. Just Diana Armstrong, I want to come back to you finally, just to talk about those headline figures that the Finance Minister has quoted. She says the additional costs facing departments and other central government bodies as a result of these changes are likely to be at least £200 million, potentially higher. She says the Barnett consequentials will fall far short of what is required by potentially tens of millions of pounds. So when you look at those numbers as a member of the Economy Committee, how concerned are you at them?
Well, we can see with the Scottish Government that the Barnett consequentials there are reduced, that they will be reduced by 2/3. So we are very, very concerned about that. It's something that we're going to have to will really deal with. We don't know what the way the economy will go. We will rely on our ministers to go forward and represent, to get the best argument to provide extra funding.
OK, we'll leave it there. It's a subject we will undoubtedly return to, the detail of the national insurance changes in our next programmes, I would have thought. Diana and Selina, thank you all very much indeed for coming in to join us. Well, 2025 will be a year of delivery from the executive, according to the First and Deputy First Ministers, who will mark 1 year in office at the start of next month. But will we see a noticeable improvement in public services, and where should the executive's priorities be focused? We'll debate that with a new panel in just a moment. But first, Darren Marshall has been gauging opinion on the Hill.
Michelle O'Neill recently outlined the Executive's delivery plan.
Discussions have focused on the delivery of a range of key actions.
Our focus must be on delivery now.
Supporting the delivery of the strategic framework to end violence against women.
To the delivery of our frontline public services in Northern Ireland.
To their delivery of public services and delivery against the draft programme for government.
Delivery, the Executive Office must be far more robust.
We will be hampering service delivery
and social care delivery.
It's about the delivery of the most urgent policy priorities that our society faces.
At the start of the new political term, it appears there's one key priority for all the main parties. Prove that Stormont can make a difference.
We absolutely need to address the social care element of health. We need to address the domiciliary care packages, how we get people through our hospitals and out of our hospitals and make sure there are care packages in place.
First Minister said this will be the year of delivery. Are you confident that in December we'll be able to say Michelle O'Neill delivered?
Well, I'm confident now that we have already delivered on many issues, but I think that we want to deliver more, and we absolutely need to deliver on those big priorities in the programme for government.
My job as an official opposition, and we haven't had one for very long in the North, is to provide an accountability mechanism. When I talk to the public, they're pleased that we're here doing this job. They see us as constructive, but also robust and fearless. We're going to hold the executive and their ministers to account, to move beyond the warm words, simply seeking credit for being here. It's not enough anymore.
There's so much that needs to be delivered because there's a huge amount of issues within infrastructure, but personally, from my point of view, I would like to see some movement in relation to my own private member's bill, which is dealing with unadopted developments across Northern Ireland, which is a huge issue facing thousands of homeowners who maybe perhaps can't sell their properties because of conditions outside their door.
So by December you think people will be able to say Stormont fixed that problem?
Well, I don't think we'll have it all completely fixed, but certainly if we're moving towards where it is going to be solved for people, that's something that people want to see.
As a whole, will this executive deliver as it has promised to start doing?
I hope so. I hope so. I know.
Is hope enough?
Well, I know our two ministers are doing everything they can. It's a difficult situation when you have 5 different political parties kind of vying for different priorities, but we're doing our best. I think that the sentiment has been right so far. I feel like having the programme for government is really positive. People want to see delivery, and that's how we'll be marked at the end of the mandate.
That's what the politicians inside the building think. But what about those who lobby for change?
Businesses are now really starting to ask the question, when are we going to see delivery? Now, the challenge with that is so many of the issues that we haven't dealt with over the past 10 years are really deep structural issues. So seeing movement on delivery on them is going to be really quite difficult and quite challenging. What we have seen is a programme for government. What we have seen is a budget agreed in difficult circumstances. The evidence is there. There is a willingness to work in partnership with us, but there is still a lack of clarity as to whether the executive is prepared to take difficult decisions. This is also a non-election year, so I think that this is really important that we get down to business this year.
We want the social inclusion strategies implemented, all of them, but particularly the gender equality strategy, which we worked so hard on in 2020, 2022. We want more progress on violence against women and girls. Some great work has been started and great work is ongoing, but we want to see the rest of the Gillen recommendations implemented.
Do you think this place can deliver?
Can it or will it are, I think, two different things. It can if it really wants to. All of those things are achievable within the 2026, the end of the mandate in 2027. Am I optimistic that all of those things will be achieved? No. Am I hopeful that they could be with enough pushing and enough political will? Yes.
Darren Marshall hearing a range of views at Stormont. Well, let's delve into some of the issues raised there. I'm joined now by the commentator Newton Emerson, the Northern Ireland editor of the Belfast Telegraph and Sunday Independent, Sam McBride, the former senior civil servant Andrew McCormick, and the economist Richard Ramsay. Welcome to all of you. Richard Ramsay, first of all, let's talk about delivery. The executive operated for 11 months last year. How did it do?
Probably too little time to tell. 11 months in terms of finance, we saw a good deal done in terms of getting over some of the financial pressures in the short term, although it's going to be in the long term, medium and longer term, there's going to be more challenges, but it's going to be a challenging time in the coming years, because I think the financial pressures are going to mount, and also what we've seen is during the pandemic and Brexit and the pandemic, the executive has had its eye off the ball of a lot of issues such as wastewater infrastructure. We've seen the NHS waiting lists, and all of those long-term pressures are now coming to the fore, and it's going to be dealing with that. And I think the challenges that we now face, it's going to be difficult given that they're arguably more challenging than before, but the actual staff and capability and leadership within the public sector, it's going to be a challenge whether they actually have the skills to deliver on it.
Newton, is 11 months enough for you to be able to say how the executive did last year?
Yes, I think I'd be very confident that it's going to do a great job for the rest of its term in staying stable, more or less keeping the lights on. The very low standard by which we judge Stormont after 2 collapses, it's going to vault over that and do very well. Very positive messaging coming through from Sinn Féin and the DUP. They're both very committed to the stability of devolution, certainly for the moment. But in terms of actual delivery, there's no reason to believe that it will do any better than before. In terms of taking difficult decisions, contentious decisions, I think that the decision-making process, if anything, at Stormont appears to be slowing down. The reason it's been impossible to judge this year is because it's taken, pardon the past year, it's taken that entire time to not actually even yet agree a programme for government and a budget. They're still in the final stages of that. They're all hands across the divide and all smiles about doing that and positive about it. That is success by Stormont standards, I'm afraid, but actual delivery, look at the one thing we can judge, that is the rating reform announced by the Finance Minister. And although she says, again, it is early days and she wants to take another year or so to look at it on a bigger picture, refusing to lift the rates cap, for example, refusing to put up rates by anything much more than inflation. These were tests that had been set by the government to raise money for the financial package.
She refused to lift the rates cap. She did suggest she was going to lift the rates cap, but maybe not by as much as some people had thought she might.
Only by a tiny amount. We've talked for over a decade, as a Sinn Féin, about almost completely doing away with it. But this tiny fiddling around after great fanfare about reform really indicates how very difficult it is for Stormont to still take any decision that anybody objects to.
OK, Sam, there's no question that tackling the problems in health and social care is obviously a huge challenge for the executive and for Mike Nesbitt in particular. I just wonder, what did you make of his statement yesterday when he said his budget is £400 million shy of where it needs to be? And then he also said, and this was interesting and people picked up on it, MLAs can't voice their concerns about the pressures in health and social care, demand unspecified action, repeat vague mantras about transformation, and then oppose actual proposed changes to hospital services. Does he have a point?
Yes, on that he does. But there are other points that other parties have about his department and how it spends public money. Health needs a heck of a lot more money every year just to stay still. We're getting older and older. We need more and more care. We're living longer. All of that's great, but it costs money. We knew that 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The question is how that money is being spent in some cases. One of my colleagues, Liam Tunney, was writing recently about something like £600 million coming through that department, not being put through the normal procurement that should be there to guard public funds. I mean, these stories come out again and again because the sums are so big. So it's easy to say, give more money to health. It needs money. That's genuine. That's sincere. But I think what's concerning about the executive, not just with health, but overall, is that while you can't judge them after a year, you would expect that after a year, you would at least have a plan, that they would say, this is what we aim to achieve. We haven't got there. This is what we're going to do. I don't see that.
Well, he has put stuff on the table. He has talked about what he wants to do.
In the vaguest
possible. The criticism was that he didn't put enough detail in there, but he actually argued about that and said there was as much detail as he could be expected to give.
So the central message from the Health Minister has been that he needs more money. And I think he's right about that. He does need more money. But when it comes to concrete proposals for closing hospitals, moving services between certain hospitals, it's at a very early stage in terms of actually delivering that. They're consulting, they're thinking, they're talking. That's part of it. But in terms of a plan for something that we knew since Bingoa had to be done, everybody said they agreed to it, but we're still nowhere near there.
Yeah, OK, well, we'll be very interesting to see what comes next, because that statement from the Health Minister felt a bit like a challenge, really, didn't it, to fellow MLAs and potentially fellow members of the executive as well. We're not going to focus exclusively, Andrew McCormick, on health and social care, but it is terribly important, and it is clearly, after the winter pressures, what everybody is talking about, and the waiting lists are a matter that concerns absolutely everybody who lives in Northern Ireland. Do you think Mike Nesbitt had a point? Was that a moment for you when you saw that statement yesterday?
It's definitely well worth trying to get past it being a political football. I mean, even yesterday in the House of Commons, you saw a lot of toing and froing between Labour and the Conservatives. It's far better to focus on actually trying to make things different. And this is where there's hope, because they're there and they're pursuing these things, trying to agree programme for government, working things through, but not enough real planning to turn the specifics, to get the specifics into place in terms of health. People have known what to do for decades. There are pilots going on, as has been reported, but well by recently there are lots of good things being done. They need done more systematically, more widely, to make a real difference. There are things that would make a real difference. There's a need for leadership, for clear accountability, for people to say, are you using the money you've got as well as you possibly could? That's one question. Are you doing good practice? If good practice isn't being applied, why not?
What did you make of Mike Nesbitt's big hint when he was talking to Bart Simpson on BBC Radio Ulster this morning that he could be considering some kind of health and social care czar who would operate under him and help to some kind of chief executive role to deliver change and to deliver a better health and social care system for everybody? Does that make sense?
It's a possible way to do things. I don't think it's the most important thing.
He seems to be thinking that way, doesn't he?
I don't think it's the most important thing. You can see if it happened, then you'd want to get behind that and make it work, or help the person make it work. But this depends on a community of leaders, leaders at trust level, at unit of management level, where they're working away to deal with specifics, because there are differences across the system and they need worked out in detail.
Yeah, so what he seemed to be suggesting, I don't want to put words into his mouth, he's not here, but my understanding of it, listening to him and having touched on this conversation previously in this studio, is that it's about taking politicians out of the equation. It's also about taking the layers of management that we have within the trusts maybe out of the equation and putting an expert in there who can, when necessary, bang heads together and make difficult decisions on behalf of the people who use the health and social care services.
So, yes, it will always be political, because there will always be times, as we saw, when there were issues around Omagh and you had an MLA elected to save Omagh Hospital. So there will always be a political dimension. You can't escape that. Yes, so let's do everything we possibly can to get objective evidence, strong leadership, because that's part of what it's about, unified leadership that makes things work as strongly as possible. And if that involves certainly banging heads together, but it's not just even banging heads, it's saying, are you doing the right things? Here are things you could be doing that would make things better.
OK, well, let's talk about leadership, because there's a conversation to be had about leadership within health and social care. We've already touched on that. When we talk, Richard Ramsay, about the problems with the roads and the wastewater infrastructure, there's a lot of focus on the Minister, John O'Dowd, understandably, you might say. But does there also need to be a focus maybe on the senior civil servants who are a key part of the decision-making and the delivery? Do we not do that as much as we maybe should do?
Absolutely. We can't just spend our way to better public services. It's all about people, processes, what people do, how they perform, leadership. And it's interesting that Lord Gus O'Donnell, who was Cabinet Secretary for the UK Civil Service under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and David Cameron, in an interview in July, he was saying that his biggest regret in running the civil service was not tackling underperformance, and how that impacted on those civil servants who do perform well. And that's an area, if we want to have world-class public services, if we want to have speedy and efficient delivery, you have to have people who are capable of doing that.
You're saying we don't have people who are capable of doing that?
Well, clearly we haven't had delivery of, we've had issues with planning, procurement. We have the York interchange. We have issues with the A5. We seem to have problems with delivery, and that isn't just due to public spending. It's, so that needs to be looked at, and have we got the skills? And there needs to be more accountability if delivery is not achieved, that there's repercussions for those individuals for not delivering that. And whether it's a case of whether in senior civil servants and public sector, you need to have people on contracts as opposed to a job for life.
Well, we'll come to the shop steward for permanent secretaries in a moment and hear Andrew McCormick's thoughts. Newton, is there good sense in what Richard Ramsay's arguing in your view?
I think that that while yes, you could certainly improve the civil service, and in fact that's an undelivered agenda from New Decade, New Approach, and from the RHI inquiry that was meant to be part of the condition of Stormont funding, and the civil service has just ignored it. There is simply the demands being placed on the civil service for decision making. The processes involved have become so elaborate that it's almost impossible to work through something like the A5 project, for example, or we've seen the Dalriadan mine public accounts inquiry or planning inquiry collapse this week because the processes, although they appear to be just basic mistakes by the Department for Infrastructure, they're so complicated and elaborate, and there's so many loose ends and people to consult.
But that is true. There's very elaborate processes. However, there is no sanction for people who don't behave well in the civil service. And that grates with the good people, as Richard was alluding to there from what Gus O'Donnell said. They're sitting side by side. They see this person who's feckless. They see somebody who screws up. They're treated no differently to them. You've got the head of the civil service, Jane Brady, brought in to reform it after RHI, brought in as an outsider. It's one of the most depressing things about Stormont. She was brought in to do this, and she says they're on a journey of continuous improvement. I mean, it's nonsense. She knows it's nonsense. We know we can see that it's nonsense, and those are the people that we trust to serve ministers.
I'm not here. Believe me, I'm not here to defend incompetence in the civil service, but I think that there also has to be a systematic review of how complicated it is to make decision-making in Northern Ireland, so that, for example, at least one layer of planning appeal could be cut out, that laws could be passed to narrow the scope for judicial review, that people aren't always watching their back for having failed to do this and that and waiting for a legal challenge. All these things are being discussed in Westminster too. We don't have to start this debate from scratch. We can look at what they're doing there and copy it over. But I think that that when you look at how long it is taking to make decisions or even not make decisions on infrastructure, you realise that we've reached the paralysis by analysis is the term. It doesn't matter how well we reform the civil service or what happens with the political dynamic at Stormont. You just can't work your way through these decades-long decision-making processes.
I think, Andrew McCormick, you remember very well Senator Maurice Hayes in his health review over 20 years ago talking about paralysis by analysis. That was a headline that was picked up at that time, and it hasn't gone away after 2 and a bit decades. Jane Brady's not here to speak for herself, but as the head of the Civil Service, she clearly has a hugely difficult job. She is spinning an awful lot of plates. So we're not talking about her personally or any other individuals personally here in this conversation. But the issue of underperformance was touched on for the for civil servants generally. And what I wanted to ask you is, are we talking here about a problem being with the system as it's constituted or the people who are operating the system?
It's a bit of both. And I have to say, I can't argue with what Richard quotes from Gus O'Donnell. He looked back and we had many discussions at senior level as to how to address underperformance. I was through one case I can remember. I won't say much about it, but dealing with it was immensely time-consuming. The process that was required to actually challenge someone's performance, because the industrial tribunals, courts have got there's a very strong weight of evidence required, and that then becomes time-consuming, and it's far easier to either brush the position away or find a way to move the person on in some way. It is very difficult.
And are we also
but it needs to be addressed.
training our civil servants to be completely risk averse? Because there are so many pitfalls potentially for them to drop into. They are actually scared to put their head above the parapet and make a difficult decision in case someone accuses them of making the wrong decision. So better to make no decision.
It's not a training factor, it's a cultural thing, and culture is the hardest thing to change. That's Machiavelli. The culture is partly influenced by media and politicians, but I remember saying many times, I never saw the PAC criticise somebody for saying to them, I made a risk-based judgment and the risk went wrong. It's much more basic stuff, as both Sam and Newton are saying, that's where the mistakes are made. Actually being able to evaluate risk and take risk, that's absolutely vital to move on. We can't actually do anything sensible without taking a degree of risk. It's having that well-judged and well-balanced.
Sam, you have a very particular insight into one example of when things went badly wrong at Stormont. You literally wrote the book on it, so you have a particular contribution to make around this table. We can identify what the problems are. I think we all know what the problems are generally. The question is, how do we go about trying to get things on the correct path to take us where we want to go?
To get onto the correct path, the Civil Service said after the RHI inquiry, we'll take all of Sir Patrick Coughlin's recommendations, we'll implement them. They said that straight up. 40% of them, years later, haven't been implemented. A few weeks ago, we had a report from the Audit Office who Sir Patrick Coughlin quite rightly put in charge because he didn't effectively, I think, trust these people to do what they said. I think that's fair to say based on what he says in his report, to keep a watching brief on them. And they found that some of those areas are going backwards. They were implementing them, now they're not. I mean, this is really basic stuff. There are complications in the civil service, there are difficulties, there are good people, there are people doing impossible jobs. All of that's true, but it's not good enough. I mean, here we are, so long after the agreement. It's a bit like the politicians being clapped for simply being there. That's not enough.
Yeah.
I find it strange that nobody's aware that we have a completely different civil service structure to Scotland. We have the departments, the big siloed departments, enormous departments. In Scotland, they have 55 directorates, so specialist teams of civil servants, say ones that specialise in building hospitals, repairing roads, paying teachers. You know, they have these specialisations, and each minister will, for each policy, will grab a group of these directorates, bring them together, say, you're specialists in these areas, devise me a policy to deliver that. Yeah. Multiple ministers might be working with directorates.
Groaning going on at the prospect.
Well, if you were going to reform the civil service, if you're going to reform the civil service, that's one model to look at. But nobody ever talks about this.
Yes. Well, maybe the reason that people don't talk about it is because look at how long it has taken us, not to fully transform health and social care in Northern Ireland. The thought of trying to also, in parallel, transform the civil service.
It didn't take Scotland very long.
Well, I mean, that's a separate argument, isn't it?
The structure of departments is hardwired in both to legislation and to the Good Friday Agreement. The whole basis of DeHunt depends on there being departments. Now, I think actually making them work together...
Depends on there being ministers, but they don't have to have a huge team in a silo of civil servants who can only work in one area of government, do they?
No, finding a way to make the system work better. There are things that could be done within the existing framework that would really make a massive positive difference.
OK. Just a quick final thought. You're the economist sitting around the table. You know about the challenges that we face from an economic point of view. Optimistic or pessimistic about where we are at this stage as we face into a new year?
For the near term, I think things shouldn't be too bad, but I think towards the second half of the year, I think things are going to be more challenging, and the public finances that public expenditure we received over the last year, that's not going to be repeated.
Yeah, and those numbers, Sam, just very briefly, those numbers that Ciamh Archibald quoted, and I mentioned earlier on, they are a big challenge. We have about 20 seconds or so.
Huge. Stormont got a lot of extra cash this year that it wasn't expecting in the middle of the year. That has camouflaged some of the difficulties. That's going to run out. It's not going to be repeated. They're going to have to take those decisions at some point. OK, we need to leave it there, folks. We're out of time. Thank you all very much indeed. There is more on the pressures on the Stormont executive to deliver on our Red Lines podcast. That's available on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts. But that's all we've got time for tonight. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics at 10 o'clock on BBC One and iPlayer. For now, though, from all of us, thanks for watching. Good night.